The camera is running. Christopher Cross sits under hot studio lights waiting to film his first music video. It's 1983. He's already won 5 Grammys, including Record of the Year, Album of the Year, Song of the Year, and Best New Artist, all in the same night. A sweep so complete that no artist has matched it since. But as the director circles him, studying his face, his body, the way he looks on screen, something shifts in the room. Cross can feel it, the whispers, the hesitation, the unspoken verdict being delivered in real time. What he doesn't yet understand is that this moment, this silent assessment under fluorescent lights, will be the beginning of his erasure. Not because his music stopped working, because his face didn't fit the revolution. Stop here for a moment and grasp the cruelty of what's about to happen. Christopher Cross didn't lose his career to drugs, scandal, or artistic collapse. He lost it to something more insidious, the arrival of a visual medium that decided his appearance disqualified him from the very fame he'd already earned. MTV didn't just ignore him. According to multiple accounts from producers and music industry insiders, executives at the network actively chose not to play his videos, not because the songs were weak, but because Cross didn't look like a rock star. He was slightly overweight, soft-featured, unremarkable in the way that makes TV executives nervous, and in the new economy of image, that was unforgivable. The man who had dominated the Grammys, outsold most of his peers, and written one of the most enduring soft rock anthems in history, was about to be buried, not by failure, but by a cultural shift that valued how you looked over the sound you made. This is the story of a man who had everything, lost it all, and spent decades trying to understand what he did wrong. The answer is darker than you think. Because Christopher Cross didn't do anything wrong. The industry just decided his face was. He was born Christopher Gebert in San Antonio, Texas in 1951, into a home where music was the only safe language. His father was a former Army surgeon, stern, exacting, and, by multiple accounts, violent. Cross has spoken publicly about the abuse he endured as a child, the way his father's rage made the house a minefield. Music became his escape. He learned guitar. He learned to sing softly, carefully, in a way that soothed instead of provoked. And somewhere in that survival strategy, he found his voice. Gentle, melodic, unthreatening, the kind of sound that wraps around you like safety. That is not incidental. That voice, the one that would later sell millions of records, was forged in a childhood where being noticed could get you hurt. By his late teens, Cross was playing in cover bands around Texas, performing other people's hits in dim bars for crowds that barely listened. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't charismatic in the traditional sense, but when he played, something happened. The room softened. People stopped talking. He had a gift for melody that felt effortless and a sincerity that made even the cynics believe him. In the early 1970s, he began writing his own material. Songs that sounded like breeze and yearning, built on jazz-inflected chords and lyrics about longing, freedom, and the dream of being somewhere else. The songs were good. He knew they were good. But no one in the industry seemed to care. For years, he shopped demos around to labels. For years, he was told the same thing. The songs are nice, but there's no edge, no hook, no star. He kept writing anyway, because the music was the only place he'd ever felt like himself. Then, in the late 1970s, something unexpected happened. Warner Bros. Signed him. Not because they saw a superstar, but because one executive, Michael McDonald, who would go on to produce Cross's debut, heard something in the demos that reminded him of the lush, sophisticated pop that Steely Dan and Fleetwood Mac had made work. Cross was given a modest budget and told to make a record. No one expected much. He recorded his self-titled debut album in 1979. It was meticulous, layered, full of soft jazz harmonies, gentle guitar work, and lyrics that felt vulnerable without being maudlin. The lead single was a song called Ride Like the Wind. It featured a guest vocal from Michael McDonald and a narrative about a fugitive racing towards the Mexican border. It was cinematic. It was strange. It was beautiful. And it became a massive hit. Ride Like the Wind climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. Radio stations played it constantly. The album started moving units, slowly at first, then faster. Warner Bros. Scrambled to push a second single. They chose Sailing, a dreamy, almost weightless ballad about escape and open water. It became even bigger. It hit number 1. It stayed there. And suddenly, Christopher Cross, this quiet, unassuming guy from San Antonio who looked more like a suburban dad than a rock star, was one of the most successful artists in the world. Here's the detail almost everyone misses. The success of Sailing had nothing to do with image. It succeeded on radio. It succeeded because people closed their eyes and felt something. In the economy of 1980, that was still enough. At the 1981 Grammy Awards, Christopher Cross won everything. Record of the Year, Album of the Year, Song of the Year, Best New Artist, Best Arrangement. It was a sweep so total that even the industry was stunned. He stood on that stage, looking slightly uncomfortable in his tuxedo, holding 5 golden gramophones, and for a brief moment, it seemed like proof that talent could still win. That you didn't need to be beautiful or dangerous or rebellious, you just needed to write songs that moved people. But even in that moment of triumph, the cracks were forming, because while Cross was dominating the Grammys, the culture was shifting underneath him. A new generation of artists was rising, artists who understood that music was no longer just sound, it was spectacle. David Bowie, Prince, Madonna, Duran Duran, these were performers who treated their image as part of the art, who understood that in the coming decade, the screen would matter as much as the song. And Christopher Cross, standing there in his ill-fitting tux, looking like a guy who just won a sales contest at a regional insurance conference, had no idea what was coming. MTV launched in August 1981. At first, it seemed like a novelty, a cable channel that played music videos 24 hours a day. Most of the industry dismissed it as a fad. But within 2 years, MTV had become the most powerful force in music. If MTV played your video, you became a star. If they didn't, you disappeared. Cross released his second album, Another Page, in 1983. The lead single was Think of Laura, a lush, melancholic ballad that became a hit after it was featured on the soap opera General Hospital. The second single was All Right, a collaboration with Peter Allen, a shimmering, up-tempo track that should have dominated the summer. By every traditional metric, Another Page should have been a smash. The songs were strong, the production was polished, Cross was still riding the momentum of his Grammy sweep. But this time, something was different. This time, there was MTV. Cross shot a video for All Right. It was a performance video, nothing elaborate, just him and the band playing in a studio with soft lighting and gentle cuts. It was tasteful, professional, exactly the kind of thing that had worked on television variety shows for decades. MTV barely played it. According to reports from music journalists and industry insiders who worked at the network during this period, MTV executives made a calculated decision. Christopher Cross didn't fit the image they were building. He wasn't cool. He wasn't edgy. He wasn't photogenic in the way the network needed. One former MTV employee later recalled in an interview that there were internal discussions about whether Cross's appearance would hurt the network's brand. The phrase used, allegedly, was that he looked too regular. Let that sink in. The man who had won 5 Grammys in a single night was now being dismissed because he looked too regular. The impact was immediate and devastating. All Right stalled on the charts. Another Page sold respectably, but nowhere near the levels of his debut. And more importantly, Cross's cultural visibility evaporated. Without MTV, younger audiences never saw him. Without younger audiences, radio stations started moving on. And without radio, the industry stopped caring. Cross kept making music. He released Every Turn of the World in 1985. It barely charted. He tried to adapt, worked with different producers, experimented with a slightly edgier sound. None of it mattered. The machine had moved on. And here is where the story becomes truly cruel. Because while Cross was disappearing, Sailing was still everywhere. It was used in commercials, it played in elevators, it became one of those songs that everyone knew but no one could quite remember who sang it. Cross's music had become so ubiquitous that it erased him. People heard the song and felt the feeling, but they didn't connect it to a person. He had become invisible in his own success. By the late 1980s, Cross was no longer a star. He was a punchline. Critics mocked his appearance, late-night hosts made jokes. The same qualities that had once made him seem authentic, his ordinariness, his lack of pretension, were now used as evidence that he never deserved the fame in the first place. And Christopher Cross, who had spent his childhood learning to make himself small to avoid his father's rage, found himself doing the same thing all over again. Only this time, the rage was coming from an entire culture. Look at this from his side for a moment. You write songs that millions of people love. You win every major award your industry can give you. You do everything right. You show up, you work hard, you don't cause trouble, you don't burn bridges. And then in less than 3 years, you're gone. Not because you failed, but because the rules changed and no one told you. Cross has spoken in interviews about how bewildering it was. He didn't understand what he'd done wrong. He'd go to industry events and people would avoid eye contact. Radio programmers who had once fought to play his music now wouldn't return his calls. He was still the same person, the songs were still good, but none of it mattered. In the 1990s, Cross continued to tour and release albums independently, playing smaller venues to audiences who remembered Sailing but didn't always remember him. He struggled financially, he went through a divorce, he dealt with depression. And for years, he carried the shame of being the guy who had it all and lost it. The industry had moved on, but Cross couldn't, because he never got an answer to the question that haunted him. Why?
Then, in the early 2000s, something unexpected happened. A new generation of musicians, artists like John Bryan, Michael Penn, and later, yacht rock revivalists, began citing Christopher Cross as an influence. They praised the craftsmanship of his songwriting, the sophistication of his arrangements, the way he'd blended jazz and pop into something that felt both accessible and intelligent. Slowly, quietly, a reassessment began. Cross started getting invited to collaborate. He appeared on podcasts. He gave interviews where he spoke candidly about what had happened to him, about how MTV had essentially erased him from the narrative. And people started to listen, not with pity, but with recognition. Because what had happened to Christopher Cross wasn't just personal, it was emblematic. He represented the moment when the music industry stopped being about sound and became about image. The moment when talent alone stopped being enough. The moment when the screen became more important than the song. In 2020, Cross contracted COVID-19. The illness was severe. He was hospitalized. For a time, he lost the ability to walk. When he recovered, he had to relearn how to play guitar. It was another layer of cruelty in a life that had already been defined by loss. But he came back. He started performing again, slowly. And when he played Sailing live, audiences didn't laugh. They sang along. Because the song had outlasted everything. It had outlasted MTV. It had outlasted the culture that tried to erase him. It had outlasted the cruelty. Go back to that moment in the studio in 1983. Christopher Cross, under the lights, waiting for the camera to love him. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the camera was never going to love him, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. He represented the old model, the idea that music could succeed on its own terms, that you could be plain and still be worthy, that the song mattered more than the face. MTV killed that idea. Not slowly, not quietly, definitively. And Christopher Cross became the sacrifice that proved the new rules. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't fail. He just existed in a body that the machine decided wasn't worth celebrating. And the cost of that decision was a career, a legacy, and decades of a man trying to understand why he'd been erased. But here's the thing they didn't count on. The songs didn't die. Sailing is still perfect. Ride Like the Wind still builds that ache. And Christopher Cross is still here, still playing, still making music for people who never stopped listening. The executives won the battle, but they didn't win the song.